Absolutely, perhaps have learnt the lessons from the past. But Lata, hang in there. Let's bring in our guest. Joining us now is Vinayak Chatterjee, Chairman of CII's National Committee on Infrastructure, also part of the committee that gave its recommendations to the government on the DFI. With us, Sunil Srivastava, the former Deputy MD of State Bank of India, and R.K. Bansal, Edelweiss ARC. Gentlemen, thanks very much for staying on. Vinayak, let me come to you first. And I know you were most excited last year, hoping that this would be a budget announcement in the last budget. It didn't come through. It's come through this time around, and it's got the cabinet approval, and now it's pending parliamentary approval. Vinayak, to the point that Lata was making on some of the lessons perhaps that have been learnt from the legacy issues of the past, and how the DFI will now be structured in order for us not to be able to repeat those. What do you believe the road ahead looks like?
Thank you, Shireen. As you can see, that it is a happy moment for all of us. That you are one of those people who are fully aware that the advocacy has taken about 4 years, but it has resulted in the government listening to the message, buying it and implementing it. So I am actually very happy that the NDA government has, in a sense, taken it to its logical conclusion in starting this DFI. I want to make 3 broad points. Before we go to dissecting the trees in the forest, let us take a helicopter view of the forest first. And I want to make 3 broad points. The nation-building approach requires developmental finance. I mean, large projects that were done in the 60s, late 50s, like the Bhakra Nangal, Damodar Valley Corporation, etc., were nation-building public works projects that gave economic returns to the country, and not just standard vanilla-flavored financial returns, which private financial markets are used to. India today requires an institution that provides developmental finance for infrastructure in the same way that the Japanese gave us, about a little short of 1 lakh crores for the bullet train, 60-year money with a 15-year moratorium at 0.6% interest. That is called developmental finance. And a nation-building approach and public works programs require that approach. So the DFI is going to fulfill a big need, which the earlier DFIs fulfilled in the 60s and 70s. And after independence, India was short of industrial capital. And in the 3 decades, 60s, 70s, and 80s, IFCI, ICICI, IDBI provided industrial capital, which allowed India to develop into an industrial powerhouse. So they had their role, they had their time. And at this point of time, the real need is the crying need for infrastructure capital with a developmental objective. If some projects in infrastructure are amenable to private sector returns, at the point that has been made earlier, God bless them, and let private markets fund those projects. But there are large swaths of expenditure, large public works programs, whether it is health or water or transportation or irrigation, that requires a developmental approach. And my last point is that there are many countries, Prime Minister Modi's international outreach, most people will agree, has been one of the finest successes in foreign policy. There are many countries in the world who are willing to give long-term developmental capital to India, provided there is a vehicle, a receptacle that can absorb those long-term developmental capital. One project was, of course, the bullet train. Before that was Delhi Metro. But they were individual projects. This time, the government has created a large vessel called a DFI, which can attract long-term developmental capital from friendly countries, people who are willing to put developmental capital in India's infrastructure, and we now have that vehicle. So I'm stopping making these 3 broad points, seeing the helicopter view of conceptually why a DFI was needed, and I'm once again reiterating my happiness that it has come into existence. Over to you.
Your smile says it all, Vinayak. I know that you've been waiting with bated breath for this to actually be approved, and it has now gone through. But Sunil Srivastava, to take Vinayak Chatterjee's points, and he's laid out the context of why we need a DFI at this point in time, and the helicopter view that he's articulated there, to the point that he's making about pension funds, sovereign funds, and that's what we heard from the finance minister as well there, that they will have the risk appetite to join hands with the DFI to put money into the DFI. Sunil, do you believe that given the context, is a much more likely possibility today?
So, Shireen, let me ride the helicopter with Vinayak. And I would say that, there is, while we await the details, but I assume that this is the first time there has been a serious attempt to actually appreciate the risk and mitigate and reduce the same through a national monitoring project pipeline. At the same time, increasing the stability and certainty of returns and making them more attractive through the tax benefits that the FM spoke about. And with all this, I think the marketability for getting the liability side catered to becomes that much easier. So I'm as excited as Vinayak is, and we are all excited that this is the first time there is a very concerted attempt to actually focus on the development of the economic infrastructure. Social infrastructure will have to be heavy lifted through other means as well. But definitely this requires a developmental framework. Okay. And that has been provided through this, the new bank, that the development bank that we are talking about, the FI.
Okay. Vinayak, I wanted to know how will this be different from the existing development finance institutions that we have. For roads, we have NHAI and NHAI bonds. For power, we have PFC, and PFC can also float bonds. For railways, we have IRFC, and they also, if you want to give tax-free status to any of these bonds, we could have given. How is this going to be different, and why will this succeed where NHAI won't?
Because for the simple reason, Lata, is that all these institutions borrow from the market at market rates of interest.
Yep.
And they onward lend. Here we are looking at an institution that's not going to be borrowing from commercial markets, but will be borrowing from very large international developmental institutions like JICA in Japan. Has PFC and REC given 0.6% loans for 60 years to the power sector with 15-year moratorium? That answers your question. There are worldwide institutions that are willing to fund India long-term with cheaper rates, with longer tenures for developmental purposes. So the debate is completely different. It can't be compared with IRCTC or PFC raising money from the market and then onward lending it to their sector. Okay. That's an existing financing model of NBFCs. Okay. This is vastly different. It is a new vehicle that's going to tap international developmental funds, which come at far, far lower rates and expectations, like the bullet train example I gave you, saying Japanese did give 1 lakh crores for 60 years at 0.6% interest with a 15-year moratorium. Can any PFC, REC borrowing from the market match that? Which means there are availability of such funds available. So, and 1 lakh crore came for the bullet train. If 1 lakh crore can come for the bullet train, surely 5 lakh crores can come for a nationwide DFI.
So you don't have to give tax concessions in that case?
You may have to. You require a bundle of supportive stuff to see that the funds do remain low cost. And that is where in the days ahead, when we see the fine print, we will see the other basket of incentives and sweeteners that will make the DFI attractive, not just for people who are investing. Now, there will be two classes of investors. Please remember that the government has said that in the medium term, it is willing to dilute down to 26% and invite developmental funds to take equity positions also. So you are looking at equity on offer. After that, you are looking at leveraging debt on offer. So the sweeteners for equity, the sweeteners for debt, all of them in the days ahead, we will look at the bill, we will look at the fine print. But the broad effort is to create a corpus of developmental capital, not commercial finance capital. And I think all of us in media need to appreciate that point. Otherwise, we didn't require a DFI.
Right. Mr. Bansal, just to take that point forward, as Vinayak was pointing out, and this is something that we heard from the finance minister as well. Of course, we will await the fine print, but the finance minister did speak of certain tax benefits for a 10-year tenure. As I pointed out, we will need to see what are the other sweeteners as part of this. But what is it that you would like clarity on? What do you believe is different this time around? What do you believe will ensure success this time around?
So, Shireen, if I look at the points which are being made, basically, I think we still need more clarity. But we also need to see why the DFI didn't succeed, whether it is IDBI, IFCI, ICICI, or including IDFC later and then IFCL. So what Vinayak is saying is altogether a different entity, I think. That is typically to fund the government infrastructure initiatives. And that should have a very long-term funding requirement. I mean, you can't compare with JBIC and JB because Japan has a very low-cost structure and they can provide 100-year loans also. See, we have been muddled in our thinking when we talk of, market economy and then we talk of government. So if government wants to have an institution to fund the government project which are risk is borne by the government, I think there is no issue. Then this DFI can also succeed. But I was telling Lata, the problem is basically resources, ALM, and your NPA classification. Now, if these same DFI, as Vinayak rightly said, if you have to borrow from the market and then compete in lending to infra and follow all the NPA norms, there will be issues. So, if we are clear that as a country we want to develop a DFI for lending to national projects where the risk is also taken by government, then in any case the issues of NPAs are also taken care. The one issue which I think we need perhaps some relaxation from RBI would be because these will be long gestation projects. As of today, if the project gets delayed by 1 year, it becomes NPA. So that also needs, I think, some relaxation. I would still feel it should be more of a credit and enhancement structure, whereby the government raises money from other PFs and other pension funds, where government gives some sort of a comfort and guarantee. Instead of, otherwise the DER seems to be from your own explanation, it is 15 to 1. I mean, then if it is a market linked structure, then 15 to 1 DER can never work.
Right. Well, we will have to, gentlemen, await the fine print. But thanks very much for joining us here with your initial reactions to the decision that has now got the cabinet's approval. Vinayak Chatterjee, Sunil Srivastava, Mr. Bansal, we will bring you back when we see the bill being taken to Parliament, which is expected within this budget session as well. So perhaps before the 25th is when we will have more details. Time now for us to head to a short break. But coming up next, Germany, France, Italy, Spain and now Sweden join the list of European countries suspending the use of Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, even as the WHO and European drug regulator recommend otherwise. That and more when we return.